Thank you, Claudia. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the fourth session of the two-day forum, which I found very useful. And we will continue the discussion today. But before we open the session, let me thank the Bundesbank and the IMF for the great hospitality and nice organization and the selection of the timely topics. In the fourth session, we'll talk about the natural resources and the macroeconomic impacts. This session will cover the conceptual frameworks and the data requirements in the field of statistics. Of course, the aim is to analyze the impacts of natural resources changes and the prices changes on the economies, whether the global economy or the resource-rich economies. Also, the role of the government and the resource-rich countries to manage the uncertainty with the oil prices, in addition to the statistical challenges when it comes to GDP and the components of the GDP and the government revenue. We have this morning Mr. Vitor Gaspar. He is the director of the Fiscal Affairs Department in the IMF, and he will present his paper, which I found very constructive and productive. As I was telling him, I mean, you discuss the issues that are the timely issues for the resource-rich countries. So, Mr. Gaspar, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Chair, for your kind words of introduction. And thanks to the organizers, the Statistics Department of the International Monetary Fund and the Bundesbank for inviting me to contribute. I will be talking about management of natural resource wealth. But let me start by placing my contribution in the context of this conference. So yesterday, you heard Ottmar Issing speak about data uncertainty and the challenges associated with construction of data, the uncertainty associated with estimating non-observable variables like the output gap. We've heard Charles Mansky and Shirakawa talk about the problem of uncertainty in data. And I went back to the contribution of Morgenstern, who spoke or wrote about the need to publish statistics accompanied by estimates of possible errors in the quantities that were published. And so I thought it would be appropriate, given that we are in Frankfurt, to quote from Goethe, who, of course, look at all these issues very close on back in the early 19th century. And what he wrote about the topic of this conference and all the problems that we face with measurement and estimates is the following. He wrote, "Happy the man who still can hope to swim safely in this sea of error. What we need, we don't really know. And what we know fulfills no need at all." Now, of course, you realize that this was in the early 19th century. At this point in time, we have made tremendous progress, so we are in much better shape. But as this conference has shown, the job is never fully done, so there is a lot that we can do better. When it comes to the issues that I will be talking about, you will see that the uncertainty associated with estimating natural resource wealth and estimating the future path of commodity prices is something which dwarfs the difficulties associated with the estimates of the output gaps. So the amount of uncertainty that we're talking about is much bigger believe me, is much bigger. So what I will be talking about is how should we leverage resource wealth to promote sustainable inclusive growth. I will look at the challenge of a volatile and uncertain world, and I will finally talk about the need for a fiscal framework for commodity exporters. What I'm presenting here is joint work with Paulo Medas, also from the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund. Paulo is a true expert on this field. I'm not, but I do, and we do, benefit from having a true specialist as the discussant in this session. So anything that I will say which is not spot on will be immediately found out. So let's move on. So this slide is basically here just to motivate the fact that contrary to what many think, commodity exporters are well spread out around the world, and commodity exporting countries are an important part of the world economy, with shares, according to various indicators, that vary between 1/5 and 1/6 of the global economy. So certainly something which is important for the world as a whole. Now, the next slide really illustrates a very important, almost I would call it a paradox. When one thinks about natural resource wealth and economic growth and development, one would think that natural resource wealth would make it easier for countries to grow and develop. Natural resource wealth gives a very important source of revenues to the general government. Hence, one would expect that social goods could be provided, making growth easier. But what you see in this chart, which is on the right-hand side of the slide, is that natural resource-rich countries actually underperform countries that do not benefit from such a blessing in terms of growth in GDP per capita. And this underperformance of resource-rich countries is sometimes labeled the resource curse, which of course is an expression which was invented by the economist the expression which was invented by the economists was Dutch disease, which was the form of the resource curse that was faced by Holland when the real exchange rate appreciated quite substantially in response to discoveries of natural resources in the Netherlands. Now, the next slide really shows the differing performance of various resource-rich countries. And what you see at the top of the panel is the stellar performance of Norway, and we will hear more about Norway in the discussion. And Norway, indeed, is a country that displays steady, sustained growth in GDP per capita, contrary to many of the other countries portrayed in the chart. On the right-hand side, you now see that the same type of comparison can be made with Chile, a stellar performer, contrasting with another group of countries. And then we changed the scale to be able to show you the extraordinary performance of another resource-rich country, Botswana, and we kept Chile in the chart so that you can actually see the difference in scale. So Botswana has been a stellar performer during this period. But many resource-rich countries, and on average, resource-rich countries have not performed very well. Now, one of the reasons why this is so is because decisions that are taken today concerning the management of natural resource wealth have long-term consequences. one can think about this type of problem in flow terms, revenues and expenditures, or one can think about this issue in terms of management of wealth. The point that I will want to emphasize in this presentation is that the wealth management point of view seems to be superior, and that's indeed something that Norway has been practicing for already some decades. And what you see here is precisely the example of Norway. And the right-hand side is particularly telling. What you see on the right-hand side is the accumulation of net financial assets by Norway. And what you have, that's in the columns, the yellow columns. And in blue, you have a line with the evolution of the estimated hydrocarbon reserves. And what you see is that as reserves are depleted, so natural wealth is declining, financial wealth has been, broadly speaking, increasing. And so wealth in Norway has been preserved. The form of the wealth has been changed, but the wealth in Norway has been preserved. This way of looking at the issue is what I'm calling a wealth management approach. This is supposed to move? Yes. So the question is, from the viewpoint of sustainable, inclusive growth, how to use the wealth. And the issue is that if you simply spend, if you have this flow approach, if you consume as you go, what's going to happen is as you deplete natural resource wealth, right, the country is becoming poorer because natural resource wealth is being depleted without another asset accumulating that compensates that depletion. But you can save this wealth in various forms, and it is crucial to think about what is the best way to accumulate this wealth. You can accumulate it in the form of, say, public capital. You can accumulate it in the form of financial assets, or you can invest in human capital. And in many times, you can invest in capital through investments in health and education. Okay? But you can do it in a number of different ways. One aspect that we want to emphasize in this presentation is that given the volatility associated with resource wealth, there is a precautionary motive to save. And that precautionary motive recommends that at least a part of the natural wealth be saved in the form of financial assets that will yield a return and can be used as a buffer against bad developments. But the point that we want to emphasize as well is that efficient and effective spending is crucial. And what you see on the right-hand side is that the experience in many of the natural resource-rich countries is that the accumulation of wealth in the form of public capital has been associated with an estimated efficiency gap in public capital. That is, the resources that were allocated to public investment did not deliver as much as one could hope for. Let's now go to the issue of uncertainty. What we see here in red is the path of oil prices. you could have a chart like this for most other commodity prices. And what you have in dashed lines in different colors is several vintages of forecasts for the oil prices. And what you see here is that the errors in the forecasts are absolutely huge. That is, there is not much difference between the forecasted path of oil prices going forward and a random walk. That is the assumption that the price will be constant going forward. But the actual evolution of oil prices shows quite considerable fluctuations. This basically means that oil prices are not, to a very large extent, forecastable. And then what you see in the next slide is that for oil exporting countries, it matters a lot. As a matter of fact, I don't have oil exporting countries in this slide. What I have here is commodity exporters in general. And what you have is that commodity exporters are on the right-hand side of this particular slide. And in the box, you have the dispersion between the 25th and the 75th percentile. And the line gives you the range between the mean and the max. And when you compare with others, and when you compare with non-commodity exporters that are also advanced economies, what you see is that the volatility of these revenues is much bigger for commodity exporters. But it gets worse. It turns out that there is a negative correlation between the oil prices and the ability of these countries to access international markets. So when the countries would need access to international markets, that access becomes harder for them. That is, the terms at which they access international markets deteriorate when the oil price comes down, which suggests that there is a problem of provision of insurance in these markets for this group of countries. So self-insurance seems to be necessary. Okay, sorry. So what you see in this chart is another way of seeing the same point. That is, what you have here is the accumulated terms of trade gains, the cumulative terms of trade gains that translated into fiscal revenue windfalls accumulated in the period from 2002 to 2012. And that's in the blue columns. And then the red dots give you what happened between 2002 and 2015. And what you see is that the fiscal revenue gains accumulated in the 10 years between 2002 and 2012 were almost completely reversed in the last 3 years. So you see the size. For example, for Angola, the fiscal revenue windfall was 3 times GDP in 10 years. We're talking about huge numbers. And then, in the last 3 years, Angola lost, in terms of fiscal revenue windfall, something like twice GDP. So we're talking really about huge shocks for this group of countries. And here what you see is that these revenue fluctuations translate in the mirror image in terms of the evolution of the overall balance. And one of the countries that has seen a larger shift around was precisely Saudi Arabia, which is almost on a par with Venezuela in terms of the level of the deficit forecast for 2015, but with a substantially higher turnaround because contrary to Venezuela, Saudi Arabia had a quite sizable balance surplus before the recent negative shock. I have a very difficult relation with this clicker. Now, what we are doing in this paper that was not much emphasized before is this idea that, quite apart from other arguments that have been used in the literature, there is a motive to save in good times, which has to do with precautionary savings. The precautionary savings case comes from the size of the fluctuations that we've seen and the persistence associated with these shocks. Since we have very large and very persistent shocks, there is a strong case for these countries to manage this uncertainty by having precautionary buffers. That's the point that we're making. We are also making the point that constitution of precautionary buffers is actually very similar, or imposes or recommends a policy which is very similar to the policy which would be advocated on the basis of fiscal stabilization considerations alone. Now, what we have here is that when you compare across countries, you see that there is an ample variety of behavior during the boom, and you see that countries have spent very differently the windfalls that they got. On the right-hand side, you have countries that were very prudent in the use of windfalls. Norway is the extreme right. And then you have on the left-hand side countries like Guinea, Angola, and Venezuela that spend quite a substantial share of the fiscal windfall. Now, what you see here is that perhaps, contrary to what would be a first intuition, what you see is that high savers, the countries that have saved more of the windfall, outperform the other countries in terms of growth, both in good and in bad times. So it does seem that there is a correlation between prudent behavior and good growth performance. Of course, there is no implication that this is a causal relation. We have not shown any evidence that this is a causal relation. So we advocate that the countries that have this natural resource wealth should clearly adopt fiscal frameworks that take these characteristics into account. And I have here the example of Colombia. And Colombia is a very interesting example. This chart is a bit similar to the one I've showed you about Norway, because you also have estimated reserves. And the estimated reserves in the case of Colombia are oil reserves. But the interesting aspect of Colombia is that proven reserves would be depleted by 2020, which is in 5 years' time. So the time horizon in the case of Colombia is particularly short, which makes the management of natural resource wealth particularly pressing in the case of Colombia. That is, it's a natural part of a medium-term framework. It cannot but be a part of a medium-term framework. Of course, one can debate whether other reserves will be found in Colombia, and whether natural resource wealth may be sharply revised up. But at this point in time, what we see is that Colombia is particularly affected by the impact of oil prices, given the relatively short horizon that Colombia suffers from. So we advocate a comprehensive fiscal framework based on 4 elements. One very important element is resilience of budget revenues. Countries should rely on a diversified source of general government revenues. Second crucial element is efficiency of spending. We saw the costs associated with efficiency gaps in public investment. It is key to have fiscal anchors that take into account the special features of resource wealth volatility. And interestingly enough, one of the variables that seems to explain best the relative performance of countries is the general strength of institutions. Okay, so we focus on these 4 elements. How am I doing for time? Okay, so I'll have to pace up slightly. So I will jump over the very important point of the resilience of budget revenues and the diversification of tax revenues in these countries, and focus on the issue of better institutions, which I believe is extremely important. What you see on the left-hand side is a comparison between resource-poor and resource-rich countries. And given the complexity associated with the management of natural resource wealth, the normative intuition is that natural resource-rich countries, given the important challenge that they face, should have, normative statement, stronger institutions than the remaining. But you see that the red line is clearly inside the blue line. So they have uniformly weaker institutions when you control for other characteristics of the countries like GDP per capita and others. So this is a difference type of chart. But it's quite shocking, in particular, because when we look at the impact of the institutions on the procyclicality of expenditures, we see that quality of institutions improves significantly the performance of fiscal rules and institutions, and we identify as particularly significant bureaucratic quality, political risk, and the legal setting. Other variables did not come out significant. So let me start to conclude. What we see, the period we are living, is one of the largest booms and busts that has been recorded in the last 100 years. So we're seeing something that in terms of performance of commodity prices is particularly marking. The volatility and uncertainty of these prices is absolutely crucial for the economic performance of these countries, for the public finance management of these countries. If these special characteristics are ignored, the economic costs can be huge. Now, at this point in time, and given the weakness of commodity prices and oil prices, all resource-rich countries have to give priority to adjustment. Now, countries that have larger buffers can choose the timing and the pace of the adjustment. There are countries that are cash-strapped and do not have that luxury. In any case, the recent developments really illustrate the importance of uncertainty in this area, and so it is crucial that resource-rich countries prepare their institutions for the next commodity cycle, which is unavoidable. Volatility in commodity prices is not going to go away. This source of risk will have to continue to be managed. Now, it turns out that the Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund does engage with countries in this area, and we are particularly active in Africa, and we are optimistic that our efforts and the authorities in many of these countries are actually taking good steps in the right direction. Quite apart from our technical assistance on the ground, we are launching the PIMA process, Public Investment Management Assessment, and in that context, we are very much looking forward improving the efficiency of public investment in many countries. In the area of the Fiscal Transparency Code, we have launched the Natural Resource Management Pillar, which is Pillar 4, and we have already performed one pilot with Peru. Last but not least, we provide a tool called FARI that allows countries to estimate the fiscal implications from various regime options in the way to manage their extractive industries. So for us, this is a very important and central priority. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let me thank Mr. Gaspar for the efficient use of time as well. I think we can trust you with the fiscal advice then. Well, we have our discussant for the paper, Ms. Hildy Pureland, if I pronounce it correctly. She's a professor of economics at the BI Norwegian Business School and director of the Center for Applied Macro and Petroleum Economics. She's from Norway, where I think they have a very good model for resource-rich countries. So we will listen from her, and hopefully we will get the benefits as the oil exporting countries they should learn. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here at this interesting conference, and also the opportunity to discuss this nice paper by Gaspar and Medos. So I very much enjoyed reading the paper, and I very much endorse what your views and your main recommendations. So I will, in my talk, I will summarize what I think is the most important and stress what I think are the most important recommendations. I will talk a little bit about the Norwegian setup, which you also have emphasized as being a sound way to manage fiscal revenues. And then and then in the end, I will be a little bit also critical of, or constructive, I would put it, about our own system as well, which is also now undergoing some changes. The discussion I will have in the end does not relate to your main recommendation, which is to building up buffer and saving, which I very much emphasize. It's about how much you should spend over the business cycle or the commodity cycles. So let's see if I'm better friends with the clicker. Yes, at least starting good. So I think you have many issues, but coming from a commodity exporting countries which already have in place a fiscal framework, I think that the key question you raised, which I very much emphasize with, is how should resource-rich countries manage the commodity price uncertainty? Because there is huge uncertainty, as you emphasized, with the forecast, and it's also huge uncertainty then in terms of estimating the revenues. And the uncertainty is not just about hypothetical revenues in the future. It's also about how much the impact on the revenues will be in current time. So there will be huge costs associated with these swings in the commodity price, which goes directly to the deficit, to the revenues, and then directly to the economy. So I think that it's extremely important to manage the revenues accumulated, so that the volatility in the price of what you are exporting is not affecting your budget directly. Because that kind of volatility will destabilize the domestic economy and undermine long-term growth, as you emphasized. I will get back to Norway in a little bit in going forward, but just to emphasize that when you looked about the resource curves, you said that on average commodity exporting countries have underperformed relative to OECD countries or the world economy as such. I think that is an extremely important message. It's also important then to emphasize that there are many commodity exporters who do quite well. Norway is one example, Botswana and Chile, as you emphasized. And it could be for many reasons, but I'm sure that one of the reasons is proper management of the resources. You emphasized that in the paper, that although you didn't talk so much about it here, that the recent fall in commodity prices is a good opportunity to review how fiscal policy can be strengthened to manage resource wealth. It is typically in bad times you need to do the action. It should have been in the good times, as you emphasized. It should have been when the windfall gains are building up that you did it, but typically now we need to many countries need to go through it. But just to emphasize the severity of this oil price decline, I put this graph forward already, emphasizing that, yes, now is a good time to look through it, but now is also an extreme time. So this is looking at the oil price, which is the black line, the current oil price decline from 2014 until today, plotted against the oil price decline we had in 1986, the green line. And you have the scale on top there. So the different scales. But what we saw that, so already during the financial crisis, we saw some of this, the vulnerability when the oil prices are or the commodity prices are declining. But then commodity prices picked up quickly again. So in Norway, we said that in Norway, we, as many other Western countries, we had expansionary fiscal policy, we had expansionary monetary policy, all helped us through the financial crisis. But the major help for the Norwegian economy after the financial crisis was oil prices kicking up again. Now, we are not so certain that this will happen. And if you compare the path after the 86, we are still underperforming, or not we, but the oil price is underperforming relative to that. So we are severing something which could be a permanent, or at least a very long-lasting decline in oil prices and other commodity prices, which then makes this even more important to manage your windfall gains. Okay. So given that commodity prices are moving up and down, and now at least down, it's important to have the long-term perspective, as you emphasize. So sound resource allocation is crucial. Eventually, these resources will be exhausted for most of these countries. And if not invested, you will end up being poorer as you consume the wealth. So management of resources, I totally agree with, should be an integrated part of the strategy for having growth in the economy. However, it's important to emphasize then that the fiscal framework setup should lead to efficient and effective allocation of resources. So in Norway, we have set it up, and I will explain it a bit in a second, but we have set it up so that we have some extra we use a certain percentage of the windfall, which we can use then for additional spending for the government. And it's important that that additional spending is used in an efficient way. So you should not set aside money for certain issues. You should set aside money to be spent in total on the most efficient way. So when you are a rich country with a lot of fiscal revenues, everybody wants to use the spending for some certain purposes. Everything is important. So how can you judge between the different issues? Well, if you are rich already, it's important to set aside for build up financial assets so you have something for the future generations. But if you are a poor country, you need also to spend a certain amount on the way. And how do you choose between the different budgets or the different the needs of the economy? Then it's important that these needs are looked up in total and that their allocations are efficient and effective so that you obtain sustainable longer-term growth. So the final thing that you emphasized was that we live in a volatile and uncertain world. And I already discussed that with regard to the commodity prices. The issue about saving for the future or saving for consumption further out is important. But you also need to address how the current spending should be managed given the fluctuation in the commodity price. So typically many countries then set up some different rules or some fiscal framework so that they should shelter the economy from these kind of commodity fluctuations. However, typically what you see is that there are some procyclicality in the spending, so that you spend more when commodity prices are high and windfall gains are increasing, and spend less in the bad times. And even in a country like Norway, you will see that this kind of procyclicality is difficult to avoid. So let me talk about that in the end. How can you avoid some of this procyclicality? Yeah, so starting with your key elements, you should have broad-based taxation, strong compliance, improve efficiency of spending, manage volatility, and quality of institutions. Quality of institution is the key thing to make sure that you save for the future and then make sure that you have efficient use as well. But the issue I'm going to talk more specific on is the volatility, because that's where I think most of the procyclicality, at least when you have the institution in place, will be the issue. So what, yeah, it is not our friend, this clicker. And now I don't want to, okay. So what about Norway? So Norway established a sovereign wealth fund in the mid-1990s, and all windfall gains, all of it, are saved in that fund. That means that we are building up huge buffer for the future. However, politicians also want to spend some on the way, and that's also the case for the Norwegians. So, okay, so we get a better one, thank you. So in 2001, we established a fiscal rule which said that the government can on average spend 4% of the fund, which is the expected real return every year. So every year we can spend 4% of a fund which is increasing with the income from the North Sea. This should smooth spending so that we have a gradual phase-in of the revenues, stabilize the economy, and thereby avoiding the Dutch disease or the resource curse. I think that's, if I should evaluate the Norwegian setup already now, I would say regarding one, check, we did that. And you already saw that in the figures, that we have saved a lot of the income and we are transforming the resources under the sea into financial assets. The second issue also with regard to the setup was that we should stabilize the fiscal impulse over and above long-term smoothing by allowing deviation for the 4% if there are large cyclical variation in the economy or sharp swings in the value of the fund due to, for instance, commodity price fluctuations. This means that the spending should be operated counter-cyclical. And we therefore also define the spending in terms of the structural non-oil balance, allowing for full effect of the automatic stabilization. So we adjust for where the economy is. Okay. Looking at the second point, I think that we have done quite well. At least when you look at in your graph, you look at the spending in Norway compared and procyclicality compared to many commodity exporting countries. You saw that Norway was always to the right. We didn't have much way to go in terms of improving, and you had many other commodity exporters on the left. But if you compare Norway to more comparable economies, like Sweden, for instance, then we have some issues regard to oil dependence. So this figure tells us that maybe despite the good setup, and I'm not talking about the fact that we save, but despite that setup, we still have a lot of procyclicality in the Norwegian economy. And it's interesting also that Norway is actually even more oil-driven than your average graph, because 25% of GDP is oil and 50% of our exports. And the figure here shows relative growth in GDP in Norway relative to Sweden. So it tells you how much did the Norwegian non-oil economy grow relative to Sweden. And on top of that, I plotted the oil price. And if you see a graph like that, you typically, there's two takes out from that graph. Yes, there is some kind of, there's a high correlation there between the commodity price and the Norwegian non-oil economy. This is the non-oil economy relative to GDP. But it also tells us that Norway grew, on average, more than Sweden. So it's drifting upwards. So Norway has grown more than Sweden, on average, in this period. But we have grown, some of that growth has to do with the fact that we have a large oil sector, which also have a lot of feedback to the Norwegian economy. Looking on the right, we have fiscal spending in Norway relative to Sweden, and correlated with the oil price. And there you see that in some periods, we seem to be highly pro-cyclical with regard to the oil price, so that in particular from 2003 and onwards, oil prices are increasing, and spending in Norway relative to Sweden is also increasing. So a lot of pro-cyclicality there. But then during the financial crisis, Norway didn't have to reduce spending as many other countries, because we had the windfall gain saved, so we could operate more counter-cyclical during this recession. So my point there is that there's two things. Yes, Norway is already doing well. We are a prime example, and I see in OECD and IMF reports, Norway is always put forward as the prime example, because we save a lot for the future. But still, with regard to being vulnerable to oil price fluctuation, Norway has some issues, given that we are an oil-driven economy. And in some of my research, I tackle these issues from different perspectives. I have research which tells about how we had productivity spillovers to other industries and why we've done so well. But I also have some research which I'll talk a little bit about here in the, how many minutes do I have left? It's over.
A couple of minutes.
2 minutes. So I'll do the 2 minutes then. So in that research, which I have together with a colleague, Leif Anders Thorsrud, we look at spending in Norway and procyclicality with regard to oil price fluctuations. So basically what we find there is that since establishing the fiscal rule, the Norwegian spending in Norway has been more procyclical with the commodity price, when commodity prices are fluctuating. However, if commodity prices are increasing due to, for instance, global growth or increased world demand, like in the financial crisis, spending have been counter-cyclical. So there's one good news and one bad news. The good news is that when the economy is booming due to growth in the world economy or growth in the Norwegian economy, the government managed to work counter-cyclical with fiscal spending. But when commodity prices increase due to war or other concern, it turns out that spending has been more pro-cyclical. And in this graph, which is then a little bit challenging if I have only half a second, it tells you exactly that. It tells you that when there's a world activity shock, left, spending relative to GDP falls, counter-cyclical. And on the scale, you see how it falls over time. When oil prices increase due to other war or supply side factors, spending has increased a bit relative to GDP. But increased a bit. So if you again compare with Ghana and other countries, we are still doing well. But again, if you compare with Norway, with maybe Sweden and others, we have had a more pro-cyclical policy with our spending. And the reason, and this is the last slide, the reason is that has a little bit to do with timing. So we established a sovereign wealth fund, which allowed us to save in the future, and we established a fiscal rule. But the fiscal rule came in 2001. It came exactly before we had this large commodity price boom, which implied that whatever we put into the fund, the value of that increased by year. And when you take 4% of a fund which is increasing, then you take also increasing with the oil price, you take also 4% out the 4% you take out will be a bit pro-cyclical with the fund. So this last graph shows the correlation between the oil price and the revision upwards of the fund, which has been highly correlated with the fund. That's in the past now. Going forward now, the Norwegian economy has had a commission to set up, which I've been part of, where we have evaluated exactly the spending rule. And the suggestion from that commission is that going forward we should spend a little bit less, but that still the framework, the way we set up the framework and saving for the future is something which we should continue with, of course, but that spending needs to be a little bit more pro-cyclical going forward. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you for sharing your experience and the constructive comments. We have 10 minutes, if you allow me just to say some comments for 2 minutes, and then we'll open it for the audience. My comments basically on the paper, and some comments that more or less related to Saudi Arabia. First comment is about the investment management. Saudi Arabia has spent over the last 10 years lots of resources in order to enhance the infrastructure and the education and health and human resources development. Government spending has increased by 9-fold during the last 10 years, and this is one of the, probably you alluded to, the pro-cyclicality. Nowadays, the intention definitely as of next year, there will be some budget cut, basically coming from the capital spending. One of the ideas that we are entertaining is the public-private partnership in order to tackle the investment projects. And this would also mitigate the issue that also you referred to, is the crowding out effect on the private sector, if any. I agree with the comments that the oil or resource-rich countries should accumulate financial assets, definitely, and that's what we have done in the last few years in order to avoid what is called the Dutch disease, which, if any, but it might not apply to Saudi Arabia given the narrow economic base. And also to manage the high volatility of or uncertainty coming from the oil prices. I have also comments on the paper itself. You mentioned that you talked about the institutional frameworks are weak and accountability is poor, and rent-seeking might be prevalent in some of the commodity or resource-rich or the oil exporting countries. But let's bear in mind that nowadays everybody is a whistleblower with the social media. So public officials, they cannot go intact without being held accountable. The other point, you talked about the volatility of commodity prices that might disturb investment plans, and it might be costly. Definitely, I agree with this, and that's what will happen in the next few years, given that the oil prices are hard to predict, but it doesn't look like that they will go to the levels that we had seen in the last few years. But in the last, or in the latest, I would say, oil boom in the last 10 years, what we have spent, it was a lot, and it allowed us to improve the infrastructure highly. On average, what we spent on just the capital spending, more than 11% of GDP in the last just 5 years. Just last year, the capital spending was about 34% of the actual spending in Saudi Arabia. The management of natural natural resources should be seen as part of the strategy of sustainable, inclusive, and broad-based growth. I totally agree with this, and that's the strategy that we are trying to adopt nowadays. When recommending the accumulation of financial reserves, scaling up public investment, or invest in the people through education and health, we have done all of the above. Reserves nowadays, even after the reduction, more than 660 billion US dollars. And more than 25% of the public spending in the last few years since the oil boom has been allocated for health and education. The last point I have in and the four pillars you talked about, I agree with the four pillars of fiscal framework that also you talked about in slide 19. But let's always think about the country's circumstances when it comes to applying some of these measures. But definitely, they are very constructive. And also, we know that IMF, they do, along with the World Bank, they do some technical assistance to the countries, which always welcome from Saudi Arabia, as you are aware of. The last word that I want to stress is, you mentioned the prudence. I would like to underline this. Prudence is very important, and hopefully we see more prudence in the coming days. I took more time than I should, so I will open it for Q&A or comments, if any. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation to Vito Gaspar. One of the key elements that you lay out in your framework is efficiency gap of public capital. Looking from statistics, I wonder how you measure efficiency of public capital.
Shall I answer?
Oh, yeah.
So we relied on earlier estimates by FAD staff, and what they have done is they have used various methodologies to derive an efficiency frontier, and then one sees how the particular country compares relative to the frontier. That can be done basically through two approaches. One is to see the productivity of public capital and the impact on economic growth using estimation as the methodology. Another alternative is simply to use survey data, very much in the spirit of what we saw yesterday, and one simply looks at how the investment effort relates to the perceived quality of public infrastructure, and the results from the two methodologies are broadly comparable.
Well, I was told that I have 1 minute, so if we have one question or comment. Okay, go ahead, please. Is the Swiss?
Good morning. My name is Gloria Peña from the Central Bank of Chile. I have just a small question regarding the fiscal rule. When you are talking about that is a weakness for some countries, you are trying to say that you need to have the fiscal rule as part of the institutional framework, or just a practice? Because in our case, we have the fiscal rule, but it's not written by law, but we practice it. So I don't know if you are saying that probably institutionally it's better to have a written or considering the whole framework.
So you actually have, in practice, two problems. One is that the design of the rules on occasion is not appropriate to the situation of the country. That's a poor design of rule problem. But the more pervasive problem is that the rules are not followed. That is, you have rules which are designed, but then when the rule becomes binding, escape clauses are repeatedly called. So, and that's probably why institutions are so important. So you have cases, like the case in Chile, where you have reasonable policies followed despite the absence of a binding explicit rule. And you have cases where you have binding explicit rules that are repeatedly not complied with. It is much better to follow a reasonable policy in the absence of rule than have a reasonable rule that is never followed.
Well, thank you so much. Let me thank Mr. Gasper and Ms. Pureland for their insightful comments and the good ideas that we heard about the natural resources and the impacts on the global economy. And I think that we'll go to the next session right away. So you will miss the coffee this morning. We'll go with Mr. De Ercole in the next session. Thank you.